Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, there was a time when news that the Saints would be playing a home game against a major rival before a crowd of only 3,000 would have been a disaster. Now, in a world turned upside down, that was actually good news. In politics, the playing is tough in several arenas, including the Orleans Parish DA's contest, as well as a U.S. Senate race, and at the legislature, which has tried to curtail some of the governor's power. We'll be looking at these stories, plus an analysis of the financial impacts the presidential candidates might have on the local economy, plus a look at the business side inside the Saints organization, and the lieutenant governor's strategy to rebuild tourism. On the field for us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Kathy Finn, freelance business journalist, Tyler Bridges, reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and Stephanie Grace, columnist, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. We go over to Errol first. And tourism, and during this pandemic, certainly for the city of New Orleans, state of Louisiana, it's taken a hit. Our lieutenant governor has some ideas.
You know, back in '73, when they had the state constitutional convention that created the new, what's still called the new constitution, one of the many issues was, what do you do about the lieutenant governor's office? Because there was a lieutenant governor's office, but not a lot for it to do other than to check on the governor's health every day and preside over the Senate. And so the idea came, well, why don't we put him in charge of tourism? And that would at least give kind of like an ambassador figure to be in charge. And so now we also have efforts, at the local level too. And so various lieutenant governors have come and gone and tried to do what they can with tourism. Now, I got to say, Billy Nungesser, who's the lieutenant governor, when he was president of Plaquemines Parish, he caught the whole BP oil spill thing. It was really right in the center of that. So after that, he ran for lieutenant governor, and then all of a sudden he gets the COVID-19. And so he's been there in terms of a major crisis. This is probably the biggest crisis in tourism in Louisiana, or maybe everywhere. This week, his office did a couple of things. They had an event called an empty tables event, where they had restaurant tables set up, but the point is there was nobody sitting behind them. So it was supposed to be like a press event to show we need to get people into the restaurants. And they were doing something in the French Quarter also to try to urge people to go to the French Quarter at the same time that the mayor is cautioning people about being large crowds in the French Quarter. So there are things that are going on. I did get to talk to him, and first of all, key to the recovery of Louisiana is going to be New Orleans, what happens here. And a point that he keeps on bringing, I don't think it's unique necessarily to Louisiana, but certainly in tourism development. But in talking about the French Quarter is what he says: cleanliness, safety, and innovation. That something that there really needs to be an effort to keep the quarter really, really clean, really, really safe, and to have innovative things and I guess maybe new museums. But one thing he's talking about, it's not necessarily in the quarter, but nearby, is a Ferris wheel, which has happened in other places, the most famous being in London. That could be a big attraction, but kind of Ferris wheel where the units would be something that maybe they have like 12 people in them at a time, and so you can party while going around. Obviously, we'd have to be away from this era of social distancing for that to happen. But anyway, there's an effort for that. He's also saying that the biggest tool, he likes to talk about the toolbox, and that the biggest tool in the toolbox these days is the riverboat cruising. And there are like about a dozen companies that are vying to be doing that within the next couple of years. Now, these are not the things that go to Cancun across the Gulf. These are the things that go up the river. Mm-hmm. They can go really as far as the river goes. But they're popular in that they're easy to get to. They're not a long trip, but it could create business in other Louisiana cities along the way, along the river towns. And so already they're talking about the river towns. Imagine cruises starting we used to have that, like with the Delta Queen and Mississippi Queen, but now we have like a lot of boats wanting to develop that business, and they see that as really being a really booming business, and perhaps taking away some of the slack that we're losing with the ocean-going cruises. Mm-hmm. As far as conventions, there are people out there. They're hustling. A lot of conventions just don't want to commit right now. Right. So long term. And, there's some talk now with the kind of virtual conferencing that we have. We're seeing more and more conferences that have gone virtual rather than in practice. I kind of think people can always like the idea of wanting to go to a place. But he tells a story which goes back to the original enabling legislation, that there was recently a convention of veterinarians. I think it was like 500 veterinarians. And he was asked to talk to the person who was the head of it. And he was talking to him. The guy was on the phone, and he was driving home. And he was talking to him, making his pitch to bring his convention to Louisiana. And the guy says, wait a minute. He says, are you really the lieutenant governor? He says, yeah. He said, look, would you mind holding on? I'm about to get home. Let me call my wife. I want my wife to hear this. So the guy gets home. He calls his wife. He says, hey, I want you to talk to the lieutenant governor of Louisiana. And she comes along and says, are you really the lieutenant governor? He says, yeah. And he says, if you all bring a convention, I'll talk to your kids, too. And so this is the, I guess, the new role, the whole ambassador idea, we see it playing out.
Definitely working. Okay, well, we'll see. I mean, definitely we want to see tourism make a comeback. It's a real economic driver here. So
it is vital. It's like the fourth largest industry in the state.
Yeah.
We're in big trouble if we can't bring it back.
All righty. Thanks a lot. Tyler, I'm going to go over to you. You know, we're just really in the throes now of this presidential race, less than 2 weeks out. So debate last night and some interesting comments from the candidates regarding oil and gas industry and fossil fuels and energy.
Right. So speaking of important industries, oil and gas is obviously a very, very important industry and has been for a long time in Louisiana, although it's not quite as important as it used to be. It's about 19% of the state's economy, although only about 3% of the jobs in the state as it's gotten completely mechanized, or much more mechanized. But yes, last night, the vice president, right at the end of the debate, people heard him say that he wants to have a transition away from oil and gas. He is a big promoter of clean energy renewables, and I'm sure that was what he said was particularly interesting for folks who live in South Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. As the president called out, you know, people in Pennsylvania and Texas, he didn't mention Louisiana, listen to this. But the vice president, Vice President Biden did afterwards sort of clarify what his intentions were there. He was talking about subsidies that he would phase out at first, I think, for oil and gas.
Right. Yeah, he did say that. But I think if you really look at his plan, his big issue is the danger of the planet heating up. And, you know, I think we are seeing this with the hurricanes that are coming more and more in intensity. And so Biden does have a plan to promote renewables, particularly solar. They're only 4% of Louisiana's energy right now come from these renewables. But his thought is to promote not only in Louisiana, but across the country. And there's some thought, particularly my colleague at The Advocate, Times-Picayune, Bob Marshall, who writes a column, believes that the wind industry, the development of that, could be particularly provide jobs for the fabricators in South Louisiana who do work offshore in the oil industry. But Biden has called for a ban on new permits in the Gulf of Mexico. So I would think that people in the oil industry might be worried about his election if he indeed becomes the next president.
Tyler, you know, this is really nothing new. We've been hearing now for quite a while of people concerned with fossil fuels and emissions, you know, let out into the air, causing global warming. So is Louisiana poised to maybe just jump on this a little bit more than maybe we're giving it credit for right now?
Yeah, Louisiana really has not done very much for renewables. Texas, for example, has put in lots and lots of wind power. Remember that the oil man, T. Boone Pickens, was the guy who was a pioneer there. And there are people who believe that there's enormous opportunities here in Louisiana as well to develop wind. But the state has not done so. And so, again, this would be part of a President Biden's plan to move the country away from fossil fuels, which cause pollution, which warm the surface, the air surface, and try to go for a cleaner future.
You know, also real quickly,
and he's really pushing it as a jobs. He's really also pushing it as a jobs measure. Mm-hmm. He's pushing it as a jobs measure, so to try to counter this loss of jobs narrative, he's saying shifting of jobs and good paying jobs. He said that specifically last night.
Yeah, that's a great point,
and
Stephanie.
we are doing
saying that just that Louisiana and that country could be a leader in this new clean industry, something that China might be in the leader of right now in terms of these new industries.
Right.
Tyler, real quick, want to touch on also the tariffs on China trade. How has that impacted Louisiana farmers, and is it a little bit better for them now? How have things worked out over these past months?
Yeah, so in 2018, folks may remember that the president imposed tariffs that then invited retaliation by China that particularly hit the farm industry. Soybeans, which is the biggest crop that goes overseas, is particularly hit. But there has been some good news lately that China is indeed buying more soybeans. Then there's the flip side that people say, or economists note, that a tariff is a tax on consumers. So it's not clear that overall whether Trump's tariffs have actually benefited the American people.
All righty, Tyler. Thanks a lot. And like we said, it's less than 2 weeks now to the election day. Of course, people are voting. I heard somebody yesterday call that day, November 3rd now election deadline. So voting going on, and just everybody go vote. That's all we can say. Okie doke. Stephanie, over to you. Talking about elections, because one thing locally that's on the ballot for Orleans is DA.
Big race. It's the top of the ballot in Orleans. Obviously, we're all hearing so much about the presidential, it's getting drowned out a little bit. But it's a really big deal. Leon Cannizzaro, of course, is leaving office after 2 terms, 12 years. And there are 4 candidates to replace him, 3 of whom are running pretty viable campaigns, and all of whom are really saying that they would be very different from Leon Cannizzaro. It's interesting. He's off stage, but he's almost the guy they're still running against because they're running against his policies and his legacy. All 3 of the lead candidates, Kiva Landrum, Jason Williams, and Arthur Hunter, are running as reformers in kind of line with the criminal justice reform movement, which is very different from Leon Cannizzaro's approach. He was a little bit of an old school lock 'em up DA and tough on crime and, moving juveniles to adult court sometimes and, using the various tools, something called multiple billing, which enabled the DA's office to pursue extended sentences against repeat offenders, but which critics have said have really led to excessive sentences for some nonviolent offenders. A lot of them are basically saying they would do things differently. All of them are saying that. There is some gradation between how they would do it, how far they would go. Jason Williams, of course, is very well known, the city council president, and he's got reform credentials from being a district attorney. Not a district attorney. He's never been a district attorney, from being a defense attorney and a city councilman, where he has passed legislation. He's been a critic of Cannizzaro's. He's passed legislation to do things like decriminalize marijuana possession and reduce bond and things like that. Arthur Hunter also has longstanding credentials in this field. I mean, he is a longtime judge, former cop, and if you ask him, he'll say he was doing this before anybody else was, before this movement kind of swept the country, which it now has. And one of the things he talks about is having run a mental health court in criminal district court, which really enabled defendants with mental health issues to be treated as they needed to be treated. He's also known as someone who's really advocated for funding of public defenders. And the third major candidate is Kiva Landrum. So her background's a little different. She is the only former prosecutor in the race. In fact, she was the interim district attorney years back before Cannizzaro when Eddie Jordan was forced to resign. And she stepped up to be the interim. So she's run this office before. She then became a judge. So she's someone who, again, comes out of the other side of criminal justice, but is really talking about how this positioned her well to do the reform, but also with kind of a knowledge base and with a balance towards sensitivity to victims and things like that. So, there are some areas where,
Jason Williams, of course, is having some issues in federal court regarding his taxes. How is this impacting his race?
Well, we don't know. It's very interesting to watch. He started off able to raise money and was still getting endorsements. There's some feeling maybe that's petering off some as the other candidates become better known or as people find out more about his indictment. He's indicted in federal court on tax charges. He's fighting them really hard. He's trying to get them thrown out. And he's also basically saying, look, I know what it's like to have prosecutors come after me. He's using it as a campaign issue. How that's it's a balance because, of course, he's the best known, but this is a big elephant in the room for him.
Has there been any kind of polling, or you mentioned the top three? They're basically at the top.
They're at the top. I mean, the fourth candidate is Morris Reed, who's a perennial candidate. He's run for DA and judge before. He's actually been a judge, and he's just not really spending money or raising money, so he's, he probably will not make the runoff. The others, really, if there is a runoff, which seems likely, could be any two of the three.
Okay,
is what people are expecting.
Okie doke. All right. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. Okay. Kathy, over to you. We heard this week that the Saints game is going to have 3,000 people in the Dome. But this pandemic has really impacted not just tourism, but the sports industry, too.
It has, and it's, of course, too early to know just exactly how much of an impact it's going to be. But clearly, it already has impacted the Saints. It's affecting all of the teams in the NFL. We've seen it's been very interesting to watch the NFL try to keep the schedule, hold to some kind of schedule, particularly a TV schedule for all of the games that are on the schedule this year, in the face of having to cancel or postpone games or move them, things like that. So there's been a lot of shuffling going on, and that's quite the juggling act. Financially, though, I think a good way to look at what the potential impact might be on the Saints is to look at their primary sources of revenue. And all of the NFL teams have basically two sources of revenue. One is local, one is national. Take a look at the local first. Local revenue encompasses ticket sales, concessions in the Dome, all kinds of, local promotions and advertising costs, that sort of thing. And last year, Forbes magazine makes an annual evaluation of all of the teams and publishes a list of all the teams and the particular financial metrics. And in their latest listing, they said that the Saints' local revenue in 2019 amounted to about $245 million. Now, that's where the hit is going to come. Obviously, ticket sales will be down this year, no matter what happens for the rest of the season. And we have no idea whether they will be able to gear up from 3,000 people in the Dome. Will it even be possible to put 70,000 people in there by the end of the season? We don't know that yet. But clearly, there will be some kind of hit to that local revenue. Coincidentally, one of the biggest costs that the team has, of course, is player costs. And according to Forbes, last year, their total player costs also came in at about $245 million. So it's obvious that if those costs hold up this year, it might be a little bit less this year, but they won't be able to cover that out of local revenue, very likely. Which brings us to the other category, which is national revenue, and a very important financial cushion for every single NFL team, because the national revenue comes from the league itself, and this is a combination of TV rights deals that they put together, national promotions, national sponsorships. Last year, the NFL's total, what they call it, a shared revenue pool. This is where all of this money goes. That total pool last year came to topped $8 billion. And according to the terms of the shared revenue pool, what they do is parcel this out equally to all 32 teams. So every single team last year received a check from the NFL for $255 million. You can see how important that becomes to their financial situations at home. So this year, quite possibly, it'll be a higher number that will come from the national revenue this year, because so far the TV contracts have held up, and it looks like the NFL is pretty optimistic about being able to meet the terms of all of those contracts. They're certainly trying very hard. So the Saints will have that perhaps $260 million coming in from the national to cover not only their player costs, but other overhead and their debt service and so forth. And keep in mind that they have a $450 million renovation going on at the Superdome. And the Saints had agreed to cover $150 million of that. So they have those costs that they have to look at as well, and some debt service. So I think Forbes has said that generally speaking, across the NFL this year, the teams could be looking at a 50-50 year. They could be looking to break even financially, which is not a bad deal when you think about it. You know, if it was a mom and pop business on Canal Street, a break-even year, they'd be lucky to hold on at all, but they don't know what's coming next year. With the Saints, with the NFL teams, you don't have a situation like that. You have a big financial cushion. And remember, too, that it's not just a matter of revenue with these teams. As Forbes has repeatedly said year after year, they publish the values of these teams, market values. In other words, if someone wanted to buy that team, approximately how much would they have to put up? In their latest listing they published for the Saints, they said that the team is worth roughly just shy of $2.5 billion. So I don't think they have to worry too much. If it does turn into a break-even year or even a little worse, it's not going to break the bank. Let's say it that way.
Yeah, well, some business challenges facing them, but you feel that they're going to come out okay.
Yeah, they're looking, the NFL is Roger Goodell keeps reiterating, he's very optimistic about the future. They're already talking about national TV contracts and national revenue that more than doubles over the next few years. So, you know, that's a huge amount coming back to those teams. So they aren't too worried. I'm not saying, I don't mean to belittle their problem. They want people in the stadium. They need their fans back for sure. But financially speaking, this is not going to break them.
I'm just wondering if in the future, if fans are going to have less income, and what kind of impact that's going to have if people, especially like NBA ticket prices, that sort of thing, if fans are going to still be able to pay those high-priced tickets, and then what impact will that have on what athletes are paid? And it just seems like at some point there's going to have to be some kind of an adjustment that goes on.
Well, that's something that I guess we'll have to wait and see. And right now we have to move on to the next segment because we're quickly running out of time. Thanks a lot, Kathy. Stephanie, back over to you. The legislature, I believe, is wrapped up its special session. And did they accomplish what they wanted to accomplish?
They might say yes. I think it's debatable. Remember, this is the Republican leadership in the legislature called itself into session, which is pretty unusual historically. Usually the governor does. Democratic governor, Republican legislature. So this is kind of part of a real separation of the two branches of government, exacerbated by COVID, because a lot of Republicans in the legislature are very angry about the governor's restrictions. So the heart of this special session was, can they kind of overthrow them in some way? So there was a lot of back and forth. There were a lot of different proposals. One that did pass is a proposal to basically give the legislature the right to almost line item veto items in a gubernatorial declaration of emergency after 30 days. That is a bill that's gone to the governor. He is expected to veto it. Okay. He has not said specifically. And then today, right before departing, they said that the Republicans in the House are signing a petition which should enable them, in theory, to get rid of the disaster declaration entirely for 7 days. The governor not happy about this at all. He has called it reckless, irresponsible, and unconscionable. I'm reading that. He just said that. And also he believes it's unconstitutional. So this is probably going to court. I think what the people in the legislature are trying to do is show their constituents that they have tried to do something. I don't know that they'll be successful. I suspect they will not be, because really, the tradition is and the kind of norms are that this is gubernatorial territory, and for good reason, for kind of command and control reason, things like that. Okay. I mean, that said, the legislators have been pretty frustrated. They feel like they haven't been communicated with. Some of it is that at that kind of personal level.
All right, Steph, thanks a lot. And we have to hurry over to Tyler right now, because I know you wanted to talk about the Senate race, Louisiana U.S. Senator Bill Cassidy running for re-election, but he has opposition.
Right. His main Democratic opponent is the mayor of Shreveport, the third largest city in the state. His name is Adrian Perkins. He's 34 years old. He's got a very, very impressive resume. He grew up with a single mother. His father abandoned the family when he was young, and he ended up going to West Point, graduated from West Point. He was an artillery officer initially in the Army. Then he became an Army Ranger, very, very difficult course you have to go through to be able to become an Army Ranger. Then he left the Army, and he spent 3 years at Harvard Law School. Another impressive thing to do, and in his third year at Harvard, he basically ran for mayor of Shreveport, was elected. So at 34 years old, he's now running to be a senator, and against Senator Cassidy, who knocked off, you'll remember, Mary Landrieu 6 years ago. And so he's now seeking a second term in the Senate.
You also wrote a piece about Senator Cassidy running a spot now about Amy Coney Barrett, of course, a Metairie native who is poised to become the next U.S. Supreme Court Justice.
Yeah, his polling, Senator Cassidy's polling, must show that it's a very popular thing to say that he will vote to confirm Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Of course, Democrats are not happy about how rushed it's been and that this is taking place so close to the election. Adrian Perkins is hitting Senator Cassidy in ads for his votes to overturn the Affordable Care Act. Mayor Perkins pointing out that 500,000 Louisianians receive health care through that act, and about 1 million people are protected under it who have pre-existing conditions.
Let me ask you this real quick. Okay, Errol, real quick.
Yeah, I noticed that Cassie's had some commercials talking about his support for the military and things he's done for the military. And I wonder if part of that is in response to what President Trump did a few weeks ago, where he was critical of the military and talked about them as being a bunch of losers. For a Republican, that's a hard blow. And so it seems like he's really trying to emphasize, I'm all behind the military.
I'm guessing that whatever ads Senator Cassidy is running like a typical candidate is based on what his polling shows, and he thinks that must be the strongest issue that he should be running in his ads. I notice also Cassidy's emphasizing his background as a doctor and trying to pass laws that will give people better coverage in the state.
All right, Tyler, thanks a lot. All right, guys, it's time for our roundup right now, and we're going to go for other stories, if you could tell us about it, and we're going to start with Errol.
Well, LSU had to tighten some of its rules today in terms of days off because of COVID. And one thing is that they cut down the Mardi Gras holiday to 1 day, which would be Mardi Gras. And that has a big impact because things like, you have those long weekends before Mardi Gras, bring in a lot of people. And so if you follow the rules, you go to LSU, you go Tuesday morning, come back Tuesday night. And that's going to have an effect on Mardi Gras.
Yes, all righty. Thanks. Steph, real quick.
We have the one election November 3rd, New Orleans. Everyone's talking about the next election. Theory is it could be for Congress if Joe Biden wins and if he kind of spirits Cedric Richmond up to the White House. Richmond, of course, has been one of his really major advisors. So could be. Maybe we'll have a congressional race.
Okay, thanks. Tyler, over to you real quick.
Yeah, I'll stick to the election issue and note people still vote early through Tuesday, October 7th, if they don't want to have to brave the lines on Election Day.
Okay. Thanks a lot, guys. And we love technology, but unfortunately we lost Kathy. So Kathy Finn, thanks for joining us. Thank you guys, Tyler and Stephanie, for joining us too. And of course, Errol, thank you all for watching. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.